The telegram arrived 3 days after Everett Colburn buried his brother in the Hardscrabble Cemetery outside Skidoo, California, and the words blurred together as dust kicked up from the desert floor, stinging his eyes, until he could barely make out the cramped handwriting that informed him a woman named Jessamine Vaughn would be arriving on the afternoon stage, expecting to become Cormac Colburn's wife. Everett stood in the merciless June heat of 1883, 6 feet 3 inches of lean, sun-hammered silence, holding that piece of yellow paper like it might catch fire in his hands. His long duster coat, charcoal wool worn nearly black at the elbows, hung open to mid-calf, and stirred in the hot wind that came off the Panamint Range, carrying nothing but grit and the smell of baked stone. Beneath it, he wore a collarless black Henley buttoned to the throat, dark trousers tucked into tall cavalry boots with silver spurs that had not made a sound all morning because he had not moved in nearly 10 minutes. He was 28 years old, but the desert had carved him older. Deep olive skin tanned to bronze across a long, narrow face, a strong aquiline nose casting its own shadow, hooded dark green eyes set deep beneath a heavy brow ridge where a thin white scar cut through his left eyebrow, a souvenir from a trail fight in Kansas 4 years back. His jaw was sharp and clean-shaven, revealing a deep cleft chin that made him look stern even when he was not trying. Black hair cropped short on the sides, with longer length on top swept back from his forehead, and at the temples that hair had already begun to silver premature streaks that caught the light when he removed his flat crown hat with its silver concho band. His hands were large, scarred across the knuckles and the backs corded with veins, and the evidence of years of rope and iron and rough living. The tip of his left ring finger was missing, lost to a branding accident when he was 19, and the stump had healed smooth and white against the darker skin around it. The pocket watch chain, tarnished brass, glinted once as he shifted his weight. Then he was still again. Skidoo sprawled before him like a wound that refused to heal. Weathered plank buildings leaning against each other for support, tin roofs buckling in the heat, a single dirt street rutted deep by wagon wheels and baked hard as pottery. Joshua trees stood sentinel on the surrounding hills, their twisted arms raised against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Sagebrush and creosote filled the spaces between structures, and the air above the road shimmered and rippled, as if the town itself was a mirage that might vanish if you blinked. Men came to Skidoo chasing silver and gold. They brought their dreams packed tight as dynamite and just as likely to blow up in their faces. Most left with nothing but dust in their lungs and dead in their pockets. Some did not leave at all, and those were the ones who filled the cemetery where Everett had stood 3 days ago, shoveling rocky desert soil onto the pine box that held what remained of his younger brother. Everett was not a miner. He was a cattleman, born to it, raised on it, shaped by it, the way water shapes stone. He could read a pasture the way other men read newspapers, could judge a cow's health at 40 yards, could break a horse with patience instead of violence, and have the animal trusting him within a week. He had no business in a mining town in the California desert, and he knew it, and he had come anyway because Cormac had written him a letter. The letter had arrived in Prescott, Arizona, where Everett was working as a ranch hand, and it had been pure Cormac from the first line to the last. The handwriting enormous, in sloppy words, misspelled with cheerful confidence, exclamation marks, scattered like seeds. The claim was producing good ore, Cormac wrote. Silver, real silver, not just traces. He needed help, he said. An extra pair of hands. Come to Skidoo, brother. We are going to be rich. It was a lie, of course. The claim had been producing barely enough to cover expenses, and Cormac had known it, and he had written the letter anyway because that was who Cormac was. An optimist, a dreamer, a man who believed that the next swing of the pickaxe would crack open a vein of pure silver and change everything. He had believed it right up until the moment the shaft collapsed on top of him and buried him under 1,000 pounds of rock and timber. Everett had been in town buying supplies when it happened. He came back to find a crowd gathered at the mine entrance, men shouting and scrambling with shovels and picks, and he had known before anyone told him. Had known from the way the men looked at him and then looked away. Had known from the silence that fell when he pushed through the crowd and saw the collapsed entrance and the dust still settling. They dug for 6 hours. Everett dug until his hands bled through his gloves, until his shoulders screamed, until the sun went down, and they worked by lantern light. They found Cormac at midnight, buried under a timber beam, and the first thing Everett recognized was the burn scars covering the back of his brother's right hand and wrist that old branding accident from the forge. The hand was reaching upward, as if Cormac had been trying to claw his way out, and Everett had to pry the fingers loose from the rock they were gripping, and that was an image that would live behind his eyes for the rest of his life. Now Cormac was in the ground, and Everett was standing in the heat holding a telegram about a woman he had never met who was coming to marry a dead man. He folded the paper carefully and put it in his inside coat pocket. Then he walked back toward the cabin. It was a poor structure, two small rooms and a tin roof that popped and pinged in the heat like a living thing. A stone fireplace that smoked badly in winter. A plank floor with gaps you could see the ground through two narrow cots, separated by a canvas curtain that Cormac had hung for privacy, that neither of them really needed since they had shared worse quarters on the trail for years. The whole place smelled like dust and lamp oil, and the ghost of Cormac's pipe tobacco, a cheap blend that had made Everett's eyes water every evening. Everett's plan had been simple and clean the way he liked things. Settle Cormac's debts. Sell the claim. Ride north to Montana where he had heard the grazing land was good and a man with cattle sense could build something. The plan had no room for complications, no space for variables he could not control. A mail-order bride arriving on the afternoon stage was about as uncontrolled a variable as he could imagine. He found the letters in Cormac's trunk tied with a faded blue ribbon that must have come from some general store, the kind of ribbon a man buys when he is trying to treat something as precious. Everett sat on his brother's narrow cot, the springs creaking beneath his weight, and untied the ribbon carefully, feeling like an intruder in a house he had lived in for 4 months. Jessamine Vaughn had written faithfully every 2 weeks for nearly 8 months. Her penmanship was neat and educated, small, precise letters that marched in even rows across cream-colored paper. Not the handwriting of a simple seamstress. The handwriting of a woman who had been taught well and had learned even better on her own. Everett read through them in order slowly the way he did everything that mattered. She wrote about her life in Boston, where she had worked as a seamstress after her parents died of influenza. Her father had been a school teacher, her mother a librarian, and between them they had given their daughter something rare, an education that went beyond what most women of her station received. She could read Latin and do sums and had devoured every novel in the lending library twice over. But education did not pay rent in a city that valued women primarily for what they could stitch. And so she stitched 12 hours a day in a cramped boarding house room, turning bolts of fabric into shirts and dresses for people who never wondered about the hands that made them. She described the boarding house, the narrow staircase that smelled of boiled cabbage, the walls thin enough to hear every cough and argument and prayer. She described the gray winters that seemed to last 9 months and the loneliness of a city filled with people who never truly saw her. She asked Cormac about California, about the sunshine and the mountains, about what kind of house they would have, about whether he liked children. But Everett read carefully the way he always did, and he noticed things between the lines. Places where her pen had pressed harder, where words had been started and then scratched out. In the third letter she had written, "There are reasons I need to leave Boston that I cannot yet share." And the ink was heavier there, as if she had gone over the words twice before deciding to let them stand. In the fifth letter, "I am not merely seeking a new life, I need a safe place." In the seventh, "Please do not ask about the scar on my face." Everett set that letter down and stared at the far wall for a long time. A woman running from something specific. Not just poverty or loneliness, but danger. He recognized the pattern because he had spent his life reading danger in landscapes and men and animals, and the signs were the same, regardless of the terrain. At the bottom of the trunk beneath the letters, he found another envelope. This one was addressed in Cormac's sloppy hand. "For Everett, only open when you need to." He picked it up, turned it over, ran his thumb along the sealed edge. The paper was cheap and slightly damp from the trunk, and whatever was inside felt thicker than a single page. Something folded in there, a document perhaps. He did not open it. He could not have explained why. Maybe because Cormac had written "when you need to," and Everett was not a man who opened doors before he was ready to walk through them. He slid the envelope into the inside pocket of his duster coat next to the telegram. Two pieces of paper now, both carrying weight far beyond their physical substance. He checked his pocket watch. A little past noon. The stage was due at 2. He spent the next hour cleaning himself up as best he could. He washed his face and hands, ran water through his hair, beat the worst of the dust from his coat. He considered shaving, but he was already clean-shaven, one of the few vanities he maintained because his father had always been clean-shaven, and it was one of the few things he had left of the man. He put on a cleaner shirt beneath the duster, though clean was a relative term in Ski-Doo, and he checked his gun belt out of habit, the holster riding low on his right hip, the weapon oiled and loaded, though he hoped to God he would not need it today. The stage pulled into Ski-Doo just after 2 in the afternoon, a dust-covered Concord coach pulled by 6 exhausted horses that looked like they had been running through the mouth of hell. The driver, a leathery man with tobacco-stained teeth, climbed down and stretched his back with an audible crack before walking around to open the door. 3 passengers emerged. First came a traveling salesman with a carpet bag and an oily smile that he aimed at no one in particular. Second was a grizzled prospector who smelled of whiskey and failure and who squinted at Ski-Doo as if he was already regretting his decision to come here. Third, stepping down carefully, one hand gripping the coach frame for balance, was a woman in a dark burgundy riding habit. Everett watched her from outside the mercantile, hat in hand, and something shifted in his chest that he did not have a name for. She was not what he had expected from the letters. He had imagined someone softer, perhaps. Someone fragile with the pale, delicate look of a city woman transplanted to a place that would break her inside a month. What he saw instead was a striking young woman in her early 20s with an air of independence that came off her like heat from a stove. Her riding habit was fitted in military-style brass buttons down the front, a high mandarin collar, a split riding skirt that revealed scuffed brown leather boots underneath the kind that had actually been used for riding, not just for show. A wide brown leather belt cinched at her waist with a tarnished silver buckle, and tucked into that belt a worn leather journal. No jewelry that he could see, except a thin braided leather cord around her left wrist. Her face was oval with sharp defined cheekbones and a pointed chin that gave her a fox-like cleverness. Large, deep-set eyes, dark brown, so dark they were nearly black, framed by thick, straight brows that gave her an intense look. Her skin was olive-toned with a warm bronze undertone, sun-darkened across her nose and forehead, in a way that said she had spent time outdoors even before this journey. Her hair was jet black, thick worn in a single heavy braid draped over one shoulder, reaching past her collarbone, and a few shorter strands had escaped at the temples and hung in rebellious wisps against her skin, and along her left jawline, thin and pale against the olive skin, a scar. One old enough to have faded completely, not new enough to be raw. A scar that ran from below her ear, nearly to her chin, in a line too straight to be an accident, too deliberate to be a fall. She carried a single worn carpet bag that looked heavy and a leather satchel slung across her body. She stood on the street and looked around Ski-Doo with those watchful eyes, and Everett recognized the way she looked because it was the way he looked at new terrain. Not frightened, assessing, measuring distances and exits and threats, cataloging the buildings and the people and the angles of approach. Her weight settled on her back foot, ready to move, and that was not the posture of a Boston seamstress. That was the posture of someone accustomed to needing to be ready. Her gaze found him. Something in her expression shifted. Not recognition, because she had never seen him before. Perhaps hope, but a specific kind of hope. The kind that has been disappointed enough times that it arrives already armored. Everett stepped forward. "Miss Vaughn." She turned fully toward him, and up close, the scar was more visible, and there was something in the set of her jaw, the slight lift of her chin, that reminded him of a Mustang he had once watched standing alone on a ridge in Wyoming, beautiful and self-contained and not about to let anyone close without a fight. "Yes." Her voice was lower than he expected, melodious, with the crisp accent of New England. "You must be Cormac. I am so glad to finally meet you." The words hit Everett like a fist to the sternum. He cleared his throat, acutely aware of the handful of people on the street who had turned to watch the way people in small towns always turn to watch anything new. "Ma'am, I need to speak with you. Perhaps we could step over to the hotel." Confusion flickered across her features. Her fingers tightened on the strap of her satchel. But she nodded. Everett took her carpet bag, surprised by how heavy it was, heavier than clothes and personal items would account for, and led her across the rutted street to the Ski-Doo Hotel, a 2-story structure that was the nicest building in town, which was not saying much. The lobby was mercifully empty except for the desk clerk, a thin man named Perkins, who nodded at Everett and developed a sudden, intense interest in his ledger book. Everett set down the carpet bag, removed his hat, held it in both hands, twisting it slowly between scarred fingers, and for a moment he looked at this woman who had traveled 2,000 miles to start a new life and tried to find words that would not shatter her. There were no such words. "Miss Vaughn, my name is Everett Colburn. Cormac was my younger brother. There was an accident at the mine, a cave-in. Cormac was killed 3 days ago. The telegram I sent must have missed you while you were traveling. I am deeply sorry." He watched the color drain from her face. Not quickly the way it happens in stories, but slowly like watching a tide go out, the warm olive tone receding to something gray and hollow. Her fingers tightened on the handle of her satchel until her knuckles went white, until the tendons stood out across the backs of her hands and her eyes went somewhere far away. A full minute passed in silence. The clock on the wall ticked. Dust motes floated in a shaft of sunlight from the window. Everett stood there with his hat in his hands and felt the full weight of his uselessness. He could break horses. He could drive cattle through a river crossing and flood. He could shoot straight and ride hard and survive conditions that killed lesser men. But he did not know how to comfort a woman standing in a hotel lobby, learning that the future she had sold everything for no longer existed. Was. The single word came out as barely a whisper, not a question, a confirmation. "Yes, ma'am." More silence. Then Jessamine Vaughn sat down in one of the worn lobby chairs, not gracefully but heavily, the way a person sits when their legs simply refuse to hold them any longer. She stared at the floor, and Everett could see her processing, could almost see the thoughts moving behind her composed expression. And what struck him was that she did not cry. Her eyes were dry, and her jaw was set, and something in her expression looked less like grief and more like a door slamming shut. "I sold everything." Her voice came out hollow like sound echoing in an empty barrel. "My mother's wedding ring, the quilt my grandmother stitched by hand, all my clothes except what fit in that bag. I have $18 and a ticket that is already used." Everett crouched down so he was at eye level with her, his knees cracking, the leather of his boots creaking. He kept his voice low and steady, the same voice he used with spooked horses, calm and certain. "I will buy you a return ticket to Boston. It is the least I can do. Cormac would have wanted you taken care of." And then Jessamine Vaughn lifted her chin, and Everett Colburn saw for the first time what was underneath the dust and the fatigue and the shock. One dark eyebrow rose slightly. The scar along her left jaw pulled tight and went white against her skin. Her gaze, when it met his, was not pleading. It was not desperate. It was challenging, fierce, and absolutely clear. "And what would I return to Mr. Colburn? A boarding house that has already rented my room, a job that hired my replacement the day I gave notice." She paused and her voice dropped lower, and something entered it that Everett recognized because he had heard it in the voices of men who had run out of country to run to. "There are other reasons I cannot go back to Boston." The way she said it, the way her hand drifted to the satchel across her body, not clutching it like luggage, but gripping it like a weapon. The way her eyes flicked to the window just for a half second, checking the street outside. And that scar on her jaw, that thin, pale line that was too straight and too deliberate. Everett understood. Not the specifics, not yet, but the shape of it. A woman who was not just looking for a new start. A woman who was running. "This is not what you signed up for," he said. "Cormac's cabin is barely fit for one person. The mine is failing. I have almost no money and a pile of debts. I am planning to leave Skidoo myself, head north to Montana." "I can work." Jessamine straightened her spine, and the movement was sudden enough that Everett nearly rocked back on his heels. "I am an excellent seamstress. I can cook. I can keep accounts. I can ride, though not well. I am not afraid of hard work, and I am not afraid of rough conditions, and I am not a burden, Mr. Colburn. I am an asset. This is not Boston. This is a mining camp in the middle of a desert that reaches 120 degrees in summer. The nearest real town is 30 miles away. Water has to be hauled from the spring. The men here are not gentle. And yet I see women living here." She nodded toward the window where across the street a woman in a calico dress was sweeping the porch of the mercantile. "I have traveled 2,000 miles alone to get to this place. That required courage, Mr. Colburn. I have plenty of it. They stared at each other in the dusty hotel lobby, and Everett felt something crack in his assessment of her. She was 22 years old, 5'6" at most, with a scar on her jaw, and $18 to her name, and she was staring down a man nearly a foot taller, with eyes that refused to look away first. He had met trail bosses with less steel. I'm leaving Ski-Doo, he said, honestly, because dishonesty would insult them both. Heading to Montana. I am a cattleman, not a miner. I only came here because Cormac asked for my help. When 2 weeks, maybe less once I settle his affairs. Jessamine's fingers pleated the fabric of her skirt, the only sign of the calculations happening behind her composed expression. Could I travel with you? Not as your wife, she added quickly, reading something in his face. As a companion. Montana must have towns where a seamstress could find employment. Every practical instinct Everett possessed told him to say no. Traveling with an unmarried woman would cause talk. Montana was 6 weeks of hard road through desert and mountain and territory where trouble could find you, whether you went looking for it or not. He traveled fast and light and alone always intended to. But he looked at Jessamine Vaughn at the set of her jaw and the straightness of her spine and the vulnerability she was trying so hard to armor over with defiance. And he saw something he recognized. A person with no place in the world that wanted them. He knew what that looked like because he had been wearing that expression for 11 years, ever since he was 17 years old, standing in a Texas churchyard watching them lower his parents into the ground. You can stay at the hotel until we leave. I will pay for the room. I will pay for my own room, thank you. She stood smoothing her skirts and something very close to a smile crossed her face, though it did not quite arrive. And I will begin looking for work tomorrow. If I am going to travel to Montana, I will need money for supplies. Everett watched her approach the desk clerk to inquire about a room, her bearing straight, her voice clear, her dark braids swinging against her back, and he realized he had just made his life considerably more complicated. He picked up her carpet bag, again felt the unexpected weight of it, and wondered what a Boston seamstress was carrying that was that heavy. Tools of her trade, perhaps, or something else entirely. The next morning, Everett rode out to the mine before dawn. The claim was in a narrow canyon about 2 miles from town, a gash in the rock where Cormac had been convinced a rich vein of silver ran deep into the mountain. The entrance to the shaft was still partially collapsed, a jumble of broken timber and rock that looked like a mouth with smashed teeth. 4 days ago, Everett had helped dig his brother's body from behind that rubble, and the memory sat in his chest like a stone that would not dissolve no matter how many times he swallowed. He stood looking at the wreckage in the early light when the desert was almost beautiful, the sky turning from gray to pink to gold, the air still cool enough to breathe without feeling like you were inhaling fire. He had come to assess the damage to figure out whether it was worth clearing the shaft properly or just sealing it and walking away. That looks like a great deal of work. He spun around, hand dropping to his holster by reflex, and found Jessamine standing behind him in the canyon. She had changed out of her riding habit into a faded men's denim work shirt with the sleeves rolled past her elbows, a pair of high-waisted dark brown canvas trousers, and those same scuffed riding boots. Her braid was wrapped and pinned up off her neck, and she carried a canteen slung across her shoulder. In this outfit, with her lean athletic build and her sun-darkened skin and her hands already showing calluses, she looked less like a Boston seamstress and more like she belonged to this landscape. "What are you doing out here?" Everett's voice came out sharper than he intended. "You should not be walking around alone. I asked the hotel clerk for directions. He said it was safe enough in daylight." She looked past him at the collapsed mine entrance, and her expression changed, the challenge draining out of it, leaving something quieter and more human. "Is this where Cormac died?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It was not your fault." "I know that. Do you? Because you look like a man carrying something heavier than that rock." Everett had no answer for that. They stood together in the canyon while the sun climbed higher and the shadows retreated, and somehow her presence beside him, the smell of lavender water absurdly incongruous in the desert heat, made the weight in his chest shift slightly. Not lighter exactly, but distributed differently, as if sharing the space with another person redistributed the gravity of grief. He began clearing rubble, partly because it needed doing, and partly because he needed to move, needed to put his body to work before his mind ate him alive. He pulled broken timbers from the pile, stacking them to one side, and it was on the third timber that he found it. He stopped, crouched down, pulled the beam closer, and turned it in his hands, and the desert seemed to go very quiet around him. The timber support had not broken. It had been cut. Sawed nearly through at the base, maybe three-quarters of the way, a clean diagonal line that no natural fracture would produce, and then the cut had been smeared with mud and dust to disguise it. Someone had weakened the support deliberately, knowing that the weight of the rock above would do the rest, knowing it was only a matter of time before the whole shaft came down on whoever was inside. Cormac had not died in an accident. Cormac had been murdered. Everett sat back on his heels, holding the timber beam across his knees, and felt something change inside him. It was not rage, not yet. Rage was hot and fast and wasteful. What moved through him was colder, slower, more precise, like a blade being drawn from a sheath. His green eyes narrowed, the muscles along his jaw flexed and locked, and for a long moment he was completely motionless. Every part of him reorganizing into a configuration that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with purpose. Jessamine was watching him. "What is it?" he considered telling her. Then he did not. He broke off the section of timber that showed the saw marks, a piece about 8 inches long, and slid it into the deep pocket of his duster coat next to Cormac's unopened letter. Nothing. Damaged wood. She did not look like she believed him. Her gaze was too sharp for comfortable lies, and he could see the question forming behind her expression. But she let it go, and Everett was grateful because he did not yet have answers to give. He had questions of his own, though. And that afternoon, when he went into town to meet with Cormac's creditors, the answers began to take shape. The name came up 3 times in the space of an hour: at the mercantile where Everett settled Cormac's tab, at the assay office where he inquired about the value of the claim, and at the saloon where an old prospector with more whiskey than sense leaned across the bar and said, "Hargrove wanted your brother's claim bad. Said there was a real vein down there, not just traces. Offered to buy it twice. Cormac said no both times." Declan Hargrove, owner of the Hargrove Mining Company, a man who had spent the last 3 years buying up every failing claim in the Skidoo district at bottom prices, consolidating them into a single operation that gave him control over the most promising mineral land in the Panamint Range. Everett went to see him. Hargrove's office was in the best building in Skidoo, which meant it had glass windows and a door that closed properly, and inside it smelled of cigar smoke and bay rum cologne, incongruous luxuries in a town where most men smelled of sweat and rock dust. Hargrove himself was about 50 heavy-set in a way that suggested good meals rather than hard labor, wearing a vest and watch chain that would have been at home in a San Francisco bank. His smile was wide and his handshake was firm, and his eyes were as flat and calculating as a card dealer's. Beside him, leaning against the wall with the studied casualness of a man who wanted you to know he was armed, stood Virgil Slade. Tall, thin, former military, from the way he held himself, with eyes that had the flat, empty quality of still water in a stagnant pond. The kind of man who could eat lunch after killing someone and not lose his appetite. "Terrible thing about your brother," Hargrove said, settling back in his chair. "Terrible. Young man like that cut down in his prime. The desert is unforgiving." He shook his head with a sympathy that stopped well short of his eyes. "I would like to help, Mr. Colburn. I know your brother had debts, and that claim is not going to work itself. I am prepared to offer you $200 for it. Cash money today. That is more than generous for a shaft that has been producing nothing but headaches." $200. Everett knew from the assay office that the land beneath that shaft might hold silver worth 20 times that amount if the vein Cormac believed in actually existed. But he had no money to reopen the mine, no equipment, no crew, and no time. He had a dead brother, a pile of debts, and a woman waiting at the hotel who was depending on him to get them both to Montana. And he had a piece of sawed timber in his coat pocket. Everett looked at Hargrove with the expression that had made drunk cowboys in trail towns put down their guns and apologize. Eyes narrowed to slits, jaw muscles flexing in slow rhythm, mouth a thin, hard line. The deliberate, absolute stillness of a man who has learned violence and chosen restraint and who wants you to understand that the choice could change at any moment. "I will think about it." Hargrove's smile tightened. Do not think too long, Mr. Colburn. This desert swallows men who move slowly. Everett held his gaze for 3 more seconds, long enough to make the silence uncomfortable, long enough to see Virgil Slade's hand drift an inch closer to his holster. Then he put on his hat, turned his back on both of them, and walked out into the sunlight. The next 10 days in Skidoo fell into a pattern. Everett worked through his brother's affairs, paying creditors, selling what could be sold, and quietly asking questions about Hargrove in every saloon and store and stable in town. Jessamine found work at the Mercantile, where the owner's pregnant wife needed help with sewing, and she earned 50 cents a day, with fingers that flew across fabric so fast the other women stopped to watch. In the evenings, she cooked simple meals on the wood stove in her hotel room and invited Everett to join her, claiming she had made too much for one person, and they sat together and talked while the desert cooled outside the window. She told him about growing up in Boston, about her father who taught school and read her Shakespeare at bedtime and died coughing blood into a handkerchief on a Tuesday morning in November. About her mother who ran the lending library and could find any book on any subject and who died 3 weeks after her husband because Jessamine said she simply could not imagine a world without him in it. About the boarding house and the endless sewing and the gray winters that felt like living inside a coffin. Everett told her about Texas, the small ranch outside Fredericksburg, the live oaks, and the creek his father teaching him to ride before he could read his mother singing hymns while she cooked supper. The fever that took both parents within a week when Everett was 17 and Cormac was 13. The relatives who did not want 2 more mouths to feed, who passed them from house to house like packages that nobody had ordered. I left when I was 19, Everett said one evening, sitting on the narrow hotel balcony while the sun dropped behind the Panamint Range in a blaze that turned the sky the color of blood and copper. Took Cormac with me. He was 15. I had $40 and a horse and no plan beyond getting us away from people who looked at us like we were charity cases. And then ranch hand, trail driver, mine guard in Colorado for a winter. Always moving. Why? Everett was quiet for a moment, watching the colors change in the sky. Never found a place that felt like home. Or maybe I was afraid to try. Afraid of building something and then losing it the way we lost the ranch, the way we lost our parents. You are afraid of permanence. He looked at her. In the fading light, her expression was enormous, with something that was not pity and not judgment, but something closer to recognition, and the scar on her jaw was a thin silver line. You sound like you understand that, he said. I understand it perfectly. She turned back to the sunset. I am afraid of trusting the wrong person, of giving someone the power to destroy me and watching them use it. She did not elaborate. He did not press. They sat in companionable silence while the stars appeared one by one, and Everett realized that this was the first time in years, maybe the first time since his parents died, that he had sat with another person and felt no need to fill the quiet with words or excuses or the sound of leaving. On his last full day in Skidoo, Everett sold the claim to Hargrove. He had no choice. Without money, equipment, or proof that the mine had been sabotaged, the claim was worth nothing to him except as leverage he could not use. He took $150 less than Hargrove's original offer because he insisted on paying some of Cormac's debts directly to avoid giving Hargrove the satisfaction of generosity. The cabin and its contents went to cover the Mercantile tab and the undertaker. When the papers were signed, Everett looked at Hargrove across the desk. He did not speak. He simply looked, and he let the looking say everything his mouth would not. Hargrove's smile faltered just for a moment, just long enough for Everett to see the man behind it, the small, calculating coward who hired other men to do his killing. Then Everett walked out and the door closed behind him, and he stood in the street and breathed the hot desert air and felt the weight of what he was carrying. $68. His horse Scout, a good animal, steady and strong, the wagon Cormac had bought last year. A second horse, a short gray mare that Cormac had named Nickel because he said she was worth 5 cents, but her heart was worth a whole dollar. His saddle and gear, 2 pieces of paper in his coat pocket, a sawed timber, and an unopened letter. And a brass pocket watch with something inside the cover that he looked at every night but had not shown to anyone in 11 years. That night, his last in Skidoo, Everett sat outside the empty cabin in his duster coat, the desert night cold enough to see his breath. He reached into his vest pocket and drew out the pocket watch, tarnished brass, warm from his body heat, and opened it. The hinge was smooth and silent. Inside the cover, the photograph. He looked at it for a long time, his angular face softening in the moonlight, and then he closed it and put it away. He looked up. Across the street on the second-floor balcony of the hotel, a figure stood in the darkness. Jessamine. He could see the outline of her braid over her shoulder, the pale shape of her face turned toward him. She did not wave. She did not call out. She simply stood there, and then she nodded a small, deliberate movement, the kind of nod exchanged between two people who have agreed to walk into the unknown together without needing to explain why. Everett nodded back. They set out on a Monday morning in early July when the desert was already sweltering at dawn. Everett drove the wagon Scout and Nickel in the traces, the leather harness creaking in rhythm with the horses' steps. The smell of horse sweat and hot dust and sage rose around them, and the wagon wheels ground over the hard-packed road with a sound like bones being rubbed together. Jessamine sat beside him on the bench seat, her face shaded by her bonnet, her few possessions packed carefully in the wagon bed, alongside barrels of water and sacks of flour and beans and salt. Her journal was tucked in her belt, and her right hand rested on it the way Everett's hand sometimes rested on his gun unconsciously out of long habit. Skidoo shrank behind them and then disappeared in a cloud of dust, and something loosened in Everett's chest, a tightness he had been carrying for 4 months without realizing it. He had never liked this place. The false hopes and desperate men and the dry, hot wind that never stopped. Montana promised something different. Open grass, clean water, mountains with snow on them, land that a man could work and build on and leave to his children. Jessamine spoke without turning her head, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. How long will the journey take? 6 weeks, maybe 8 if we run into trouble. We follow the stage route through Nevada, then cut across Idaho and up into Montana. That is a long time. You can still change your mind. We could turn around, get you on a stage back east. She did not turn her head. Her hand stayed on the journal. Her voice was flat and certain, the voice of someone who has closed every door behind them and has no intention of checking that whether any of them can be reopened. I am going forward, Mr. Colburn. Never back. The road stretched north into the shimmering heat, winding through the mountains toward Nevada and whatever lay beyond. Two people who had nothing in common except loss and stubbornness and a refusal to stop moving. Two horses pulling a wagon loaded with everything they owned, which was almost nothing. $75 between them, a worn leather journal, a hunting knife hidden in the folds of a riding skirt, a sawed piece of timber, an unopened letter, and a brass pocket watch with a photograph inside that Everett Colburn looked at every night but had never shown to a living soul. The desert swallowed them whole, and the dust settled behind them, and Skidoo went back to the business of dying slowly in the California heat. The first week on the trail taught Everett 2 things about Jessamine Vaughn that he had not expected. The first was that she learned fast. The second was that she never complained. The heat was extraordinary even by desert standards. By mid-morning, the air turned solid, a shimmering wall of white light that pressed down on them like a physical weight, and the horses moved through it with their heads low and their sides dark with sweat. Everett stopped every 2 hours to rest them, rationing water from the barrels with the careful precision of a man who understood that arithmetic was the difference between living and dying out here. So many gallons for the horses, so many for the 2 of them, so many miles to the next water source. And if the numbers did not balance, you did not make it. He kept this calculation running in his head, and at all times a quiet, constant math that operated beneath his other thoughts, the way a clock operates beneath the sounds of a room, Jessamine noticed. On the 3rd day, she asked him about it, and when he explained, she opened her journal and began keeping the numbers herself. Gallons remaining the miles traveled, miles to the next spring or creek daily consumption rate. Her handwriting was small and precise, and her figures were accurate, and after that, Everett did not have to keep the calculation alone. She learned to cook over an open fire through trial and error, heavy on the error at first. The first night's beans were burned black on the bottom and raw in the middle, and the hardtack she tried to soften in water turned into a paste that looked like something you would use to seal a roof. Everett ate it without comment. On the 2nd night, the beans were better. By the 4th night, she had figured out how to bank the coals so the heat was even, and she produced a meal of beans and salt pork and cornbread cooked in the cast iron skillet that was genuinely good. Better, Everett said. Jessamine looked at him across the fire, one eyebrow raised, that half smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. High praise from a man who uses words like he is being charged by the letter. It was the first time she had made him almost smile. He caught it before it arrived, turned it into a nod, and looked away. But something had shifted, some small gear clicking into a new position, and they both felt it, even if neither of them said so. The days fell into a rhythm governed by sun and distance and the endurance of horses. Everett drove the wagon while Jessamine sat beside him on the bench seat, and they talked. Not constantly, and not about anything that mattered, at least not at first. He taught her to read the land the way his father had taught him, pointing out the signs that most people missed. A line of greener vegetation that meant water close to the surface. The way certain rock formations channeled wind and created natural shelter. Which plants were safe to eat in an emergency, and which would give you cramps or worse. The behavior of birds that could lead you to water if you watched their flight patterns in the evening. She wrote everything down in her journal. She asked follow-up questions that showed she was not just listening, but thinking, connecting the information to what she already knew, building a framework of understanding. Everett found himself explaining more than he usually would, going deeper, because her questions deserved real answers, and because he discovered that teaching something to someone who genuinely wanted to learn was a pleasure he had not experienced before. In return, she told him about books, stories of adventure and romance, and distant places that had kept her sane during years of gray winters and endless sewing. She described them so vividly that the desert around them seemed to fade, replaced briefly by oceans and castles and cities she had never seen except through the words of other people. Everett listened without commenting much, but she noticed as she noticed everything that he remembered the details. 3 days after she mentioned a novel about a sea captain, he referred back to a specific scene she had described, and the surprise on her face was worth more than the smile he did not give her. One afternoon when they were stopped to rest the horses in the thin shade of a rock outcropping, a harness strap on Scout's bridle snapped. The leather was old and had been weakening for days. Everett was reaching for his saddlebag to find something to repair it when Jessamine opened her carpet bag, the heavy one, and pulled out a leather sewing kit that explained at least some of the weight. Heavy needles, wax thread as thick as fishing line, a curved awl, a small block of beeswax. She took the broken strap and stitched it with a saddle stitch so tight and even that the repair was stronger than the original leather on either side of it. Everett watched her hands work. Precise, confident, fast. The same hands that had been sewing shirts in a Boston boarding house, now repairing horse tack in the middle of a desert as if she had done it all her life. "You stitch leather better than most ranch hands I have known," he said. Jessamine shrugged without looking up. "Leather is leather. Fabric or hide, the principles are the same. You respect the material, you use the right tool, you do not rush the stitch." He nodded and filed that away alongside everything else he was learning about this woman who was nothing like what he had expected and everything like what he had not known he needed. At night, they maintained the boundary they had established without discussion. Jessamine slept in the wagon bed curtained by the canvas cover. Everett bedded down by the fire, his saddle for a pillow, his duster coat pulled over him against the desert cold that arrived like a stranger once the sun went down. They were scrupulously careful about propriety, maintaining a respectful distance that was as much about self-preservation as reputation, because the alternative was a conversation neither of them was ready to have. But Everett was aware of her. In the darkness, with the fire dying to embers and the stars blazing in a black sky so vast it made you feel like you were falling upward, he could hear the soft sounds of her breathing from the wagon a few yards away. The rustle of fabric when she shifted position, the scratch of her pen when she wrote in her journal by candlelight, a small golden glow visible through gaps in the canvas. And once, just once, the quiet sound of the leather wrapping being unfolded and the faint metallic whisper of a blade being drawn and checked and sheathed again. Her knife. She checked it every night the way he checked his gun. Two people armed against the dark in different ways, for different reasons, lying a few yards apart and pretending they did not notice each other. Everett's own nighttime ritual was simpler and older. When the camp was quiet and the horses were settled, he would draw out the pocket watch and open it. The brass was warm from his body, and the hinge moved silently. He would look at what was inside the cover for a long time, his face losing its severity in the firelight, the hard lines softening into something that looked almost like the boy he had been before the world taught him to lock everything away. Then he would close it, return it to his vest, and stare at the stars until sleep came or did not. Some nights he also reached into his coat pocket and touched the piece of sawed timber, ran his thumb along the cut edge where the saw teeth had bitten through the wood, felt the smooth diagonal that no natural break would produce. And the cold thing inside him, the blade that had been drawn from its sheath the day he found that evidence, would turn slowly in the dark, patient waiting. 2 weeks into the journey, they reached a small town in Nevada where Everett wanted to buy additional supplies. The town had no name he could remember later, just a collection of buildings around a crossroads, but it had a mercantile with a reasonably stocked shelf and a hotel with beds that were marginally softer than the wagon floor. They went into the mercantile together, and the shopkeeper's wife, a pinch-faced woman with eyes like a hawk watching for field mice, looked them over with the kind of detailed assessment that would have done credit to a federal marshal. "Your wife is very young," the woman said to Everett as she weighed out flour. "She is not my wife," Everett said automatically, and then watched the woman's expression cycle through surprise, suspicion, and moral outrage in the space of about 2 seconds. Jessamine stepped in before the situation could catch fire. "We are cousins," she said smoothly, her Boston accent lending the lie an air of educated respectability. "Traveling to Montana to join other family members." The woman's eyes said she did not believe a word of it, but she wrapped their purchases and took their money, and when they left the store, Everett gave Jessamine a look, and that was the closest he came to expressing gratitude without actually speaking the words. "Quick thinking. We need to be more careful." Jessamine's voice was low and practical as they walked back toward the hotel. "People will assume the worst, and in a place like this, assumptions become rumors, and rumors become trouble. For both of us. What do you suggest?" She stopped walking and turned to face him. The afternoon sun was behind her, outlining her in gold, and her expression was steady and clear. "In the next town, we should say we are married. It will make things simpler." "You are suggesting that a false marriage." "I am suggesting a practical arrangement for the duration of the journey. When we reach Montana and go our separate ways, it will not matter. And when we reach Montana, you could say I am a widow. That would explain why I am alone." Everett considered this. He looked at her standing in the dusty street of a nameless town in Nevada, a woman who had already reinvented herself once to survive and was willing to do it again, and he felt something that he identified after some effort as admiration. "Agreed." They shook hands, formal and deliberate, as if sealing a business contract, which in a way they were. Her hand was smaller than his, calloused at the fingertips from years of needlework, and it fit between his scarred fingers with a rightness that he tried very hard not to notice, and failed completely. The false marriage changed everything and nothing. They could share a table in hotel dining rooms without drawing stairs. They could rent rooms together when the alternative was camping in dangerous territory. When only one room was available, which happened more often than was convenient. Everett insisted Jessamine take the bed while he slept on the floor, and this arrangement was never debated because Everett Colburn did not debate matters of basic decency. But in those shared rooms, lying in the darkness with only a few feet of air between them, conversation became unavoidable. The dark was a confessional, stripping away the careful distance they maintained during the day, and words came easier when you could not see the other person's face. "Tell me about Montana," Jessamine said one night in a hotel room in northern Nevada that was barely larger than a closet and smelled of pine sap and old tobacco. The window was open, and a dry wind moved the curtain, and somewhere outside, a coyote was singing to the moon. Everett lay on the floor with his head on his saddle, his duster coat spread over him, staring at the water-stained ceiling. Land, good grass, clean water coming down from the mountains. Cattle country, real cattle country, not this rock and sand. I want to build a ranch. Small to start, maybe 20 head enough to grow on. Something that is mine. Something that lasts. A home. Yes. And a family. The question hung in the dark like smoke. Everett was quiet for a long time, long enough that the coyote finished its song and started another. Someday, if I find the right person. What kind of person would be right for a rancher in Montana? Strong, not just in the body, but here. He tapped his chest, though she could not see the gesture. Someone who is not afraid of hard work or isolation. Someone who can find beauty in open space and silence, in winters that last half the year. That sounds lonely. It would be with the wrong person. With the right one, it would be everything. Jessamine was silent for so long that Everett thought she had fallen asleep, and he was composing himself for sleep as well, when her voice came through the darkness, very soft, barely above a whisper. I think you will find her, Everett. It was the first time she had used his given name. The sound of it in her voice did something to his chest that he had no experience with and no defense against. He wanted to say that he already had, that she was lying 5 feet above him in a narrow bed in a nameless town, and he had known it since the day she lifted her chin in that hotel lobby in Skidoo and refused to break. But the words would not come because saying them would change things that could not be unchanged. And she had asked him for time, and time was the one thing he had always been willing to give. They crossed into Idaho in the third week of July, and the world changed around them. The desert fell away behind them like a fever breaking, replaced by green that hurt the eyes after weeks of brown and gray. Pine forests climbed the mountains, creeks ran with actual water, instead of the memory of water, and the air had a sweetness to it that Jessamine breathed in with her eyes closed, her face tipped up, looking for all the world like a woman being baptized. Everett watched her and felt the blade inside him turn not the cold one that was waiting for Hargrove, but a different one entirely sharp and warm and terrifying. It was on the third day in Idaho that the rattlesnake struck. They had stopped to rest the horses beside a dry wash, and Everett was checking Scout's hooves, crouched down with the horse's left foreleg bent back against his knee when the buzzing started. It was a sound you learned to recognize on the frontier, or you learned it too late. And Everett knew what it was before he saw the snake coiled in the shade of a rock not 3 feet from his right arm. He started to move, started to drop the hoof and step back, but the snake was faster. Rattlesnakes are always faster. The strike was a blur, 2 punctures through the cotton of his right sleeve and into the meat of his forearm, and then the snake was gone, sliding into the rocks, and Everett was sitting in the dirt looking at 2 small holes in his arm that were already beginning to well with blood. The world tilted, not immediately, but within minutes, a slow rotation, as if the landscape had been set spinning by an unseen hand. He pressed his left hand over the wound, his short-fingered hand the stump of his ring finger white against the blood, and he tried to stand and found that his legs had developed opinions of their own about whether standing was advisable. Jessamine was beside him in seconds. He did not see where she came from, only that she was there kneeling in the dirt, and in her right hand was the hunting knife from her riding skirt drawn so fast and so naturally that it was clear this was not the first time she had pulled a blade in an emergency. Do not move. Her voice was calm, controlled the voice of a person operating on training rather than panic. She cut the sleeve of his shirt with 2 quick strokes, exposing the bite. 2 puncture marks on the outside of his forearm, the skin around them already swelling and discoloring. She tore a strip from the bottom of her shirt and tied it tight above the wound, not a tourniquet exactly, but pressure slowing the spread. I need you to lie down. She had his arm in both hands examining the wound, and her fingers were steady. Lie back, head lower than your heart. Everett obeyed not because he was good at taking orders, but because the world was tilting further now, and lying down seemed like less of a choice and more of an inevitability. The sky above him was very blue and very far away, and Jessamine's face appeared in his field of vision, backlit by that blue, her braid hanging down and nearly brushing his chest. Stay with me, Everett. Stay awake. He tried. He honestly tried, but the venom was working, and the desert heat was pressing down, and somewhere between one heartbeat and the next, the blue sky turned gray, and then black, and he was gone. What followed was a night that Jessamine Vaughn would remember for the rest of her life, with a clarity that time never softened. She moved Everett into the shade of the wagon. She soaked cloth in water from the barrel and laid it across his forehead. She checked the wound every hour, watching the swelling spread up his arm, watching his skin go from bronze to gray, watching the fever climb until his body radiated heat like a stove. He was delirious by sundown, muttering words she could not make out. And once he said Cormac's name and reached out with his left hand as if trying to pull someone from a pile of rubble, and she caught that hand and held it, the shortened ring finger pressing against her palm, and she did not let go. The desert night came down cold and black and enormous. She built the fire up and sat beside him, his hand in hers, and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient and different patterns, while the coyotes sang and the horses shifted nervously in their traces. She was alone, 200 miles from the nearest real town. The man beside her was dying, or he was not, and there was nothing she could do about it except keep him cool and keep the fire burning and wait. She talked to him, not because she thought he could hear, but because the silence was a living thing that would swallow her whole if she let it. You are not going to die. Her voice was low, rough with the dust and the exhaustion and the fear she had locked away so tightly it had turned to something sharp in her throat. Do you hear me, Everett Colburn? You are not allowed. I have lost too many people, and I will not lose you. Not you. She looked at his face in the firelight. The severe lines softened by unconsciousness. The hard jaw slacked the scar through his left eyebrow, pale in the flickering light. He looked younger when he was not awake to arrange his features into that mask of cold patience. He looked like someone who had been hurt and had decided that the only safe response was to never let anyone close enough to do it again. You are the first man who has looked at me and not wanted something. Her voice cracked. The first person since my parents died who has treated me as if I have value beyond what I can do for them. You have not asked me about the scar. You have not asked me what I am running from. You have just let me be, and you do not know what that means, and I cannot tell you because you are unconscious, and that is the only reason I am saying any of this. She wiped her eyes with the back of her free hand, the hand that was not holding his, and took a breath that shuddered. Please do not die. Morning came, the sun rose over the Nevada desert and turned the sky from black to gray to gold, and Everett Colburn was still alive. His fever had not broken, but it had not climbed higher, and that was something. Jessamine changed the wet cloth on his forehead and checked the wound, which was ugly, but not the angry red of infection. She gave him water in small sips, tilting his head, and some of it went in and some of it ran down his jaw, and she wiped it away with a tenderness that would have startled her if she had been paying attention to herself. She heard the sound around mid-morning, the slow clop of hooves on hard ground, the creak of a cart, the particular rattle of glass bottles in a wooden case. She stood and shaded her eyes and saw coming down the trail from the north a single figure on a mule pulling a small cart behind him. The man who rode into their camp was not what the landscape suggested. He was 6 feet tall, exactly spare, and whittled down to nothing but sinew and purpose. A man built by decades of frontier life, the way a river builds a canyon by removing everything unnecessary. His skin was dark brown, weathered to near mahogany, and his face was carved with deep expression lines that mapped a hard life lived honestly, every loss and every choice written in the furrows of his brow and the hollows of his cheeks. He had a high, wide forehead, a strong, broad nose, full lips pressed in thoughtful consideration, and warm, steady, dark brown eyes that carried both sorrow and a hard-won serenity, as if he had walked through fire and come out the other side not unburned but unbroken. He wore small, round spectacles perched on his nose, bridge-thin wire frames that caught the morning light and turned it to small stars. His hair was close-cropped, salt and pepper, more silver than black, kept short and neat. A dark brown wool vest buttoned over a clean white collarless cotton shirt with sleeves rolled precisely to mid-forearm. Simple dark trousers and polished brown leather shoes, not boots, and that detail said more than any introduction could. Boots meant the frontier. Shoes meant education, meant somewhere else, meant a man who had chosen to be here rather than a man the land had simply caught and kept. A small leather-bound book was visible in one vest pocket, a carved wooden pipe in the other. No gun belt, no knife, no weapon of any kind. He dismounted from the mule with the careful economy of a man who respects his aging joints, and he walked into the camp with his hands visible and open and his eyes taking in everything: the wagon, the horses, the woman standing with her hand near the knife at her belt, the man lying motionless on the ground. Ma'am, his voice was deep and unhurried, the voice of a man who measured his words the way a pharmacist measures doses. I am Ezekiel Holloway. Most people call me Zeke. I was a surgeon during the war and I have practiced medicine since. May I examine your companion? Jessamine studied him for a 3 count, her gaze sharp as flint, reading him the way Everett would have read him if Everett had been conscious. Then she stepped aside. Zeke knelt beside Everett with the smooth practiced motion of a man who had knelt beside wounded men more times than he could count. His hands were long and elegant. The fingers of a pianist, which in fact he had been once in another life before the war, took the piano and most of the life that went with it. Those hands moved with practiced, gentle precision as he examined the wound, checked the pulse, lifted the eyelids to look at the pupils. Rattlesnake, Western Diamondback from the look of it. How long ago? Yesterday afternoon, around 4. You kept him hydrated and cool. That was exactly right. Zeke opened a worn leather medical bag from his cart, and inside Jessamine could see glass bottles and rolled bandages and instruments wrapped in cloth. He cleaned the wound with a solution that smelled sharply of alcohol, applied a poultice of herbs that he mixed from several small pouches, and gave Everett a measured dose of something from a brown bottle. His hands never hesitated, never trembled, and his expression throughout was one of focused, tender concentration, a man for whom healing was not a profession, but a calling. Will he live? Jessamine's voice was steady, almost. The next 12 hours will tell. The venom has had time to spread, but he is strong and healthy, and the bite was on the forearm, not the torso. If the fever breaks by tonight, he will recover. Zeke looked at her over his spectacles. You did well. The pressure dressing slowed the absorption considerably. You have done this before. It was not a question exactly, but it hung in the air like one. Jessamine's hand drifted unconsciously to the scar on her jaw. Not snake bite, but I have dealt with wounds. Zeke nodded, accepting this without pressing. He sat back on his heels and surveyed the camp with those warm, steady eyes. I am heading to Montana myself. There's a community there that needs a physician. I travel slowly because my books are heavy and my mule is old. The ghost of a smile crossed his weathered face. If your companion recovers, which I believe he will, you might consider allowing me to join you. There is safety in numbers, and I am a passable cook. He is not my husband, Jessamine said, and then wondered why she had felt the need to say it. Regardless, Zeke began repacking his medical bag, his long fingers gentle with the bottles. You saved his life last night. That speaks more truthfully than any ceremony. The fever broke that evening. Everett opened his eyes to firelight and stars and the smell of something cooking that was considerably better than anything he or Jessamine had produced in 3 weeks on the trail. He turned his head and saw a man he did not recognize sitting by the fire stirring a pot with one hand while holding a small book in the other, reading by the flickering light through spectacles that glowed like 2 small moons. Jessamine appeared above him. Her face was drawn with fatigue, dark circles beneath her eyes, but something in her expression loosened when she saw him looking back at her. Welcome back, she said quietly. How long? A day and a night. A man named Zeke Holloway found us this morning. He is a doctor. He treated the bite. Everett's eyes moved to the man by the fire. Zeke looked up from his book and nodded a small, precise movement, and Everett recognized something in those steady eyes behind the spectacles, a quality he had encountered in only a handful of men in his life. Not threat, not weakness. Something closer to gravity, the kind that pulled you into orbit without you realizing it was happening. Mr. Colburn, Zeke's voice was warm and unhurried. You are a fortunate man. The snake, the desert, and the fever each had a fair chance at you, and your companion defeated all 3. I merely arrived in time for the cleanup. Everett looked at Jessamine. She looked away, but not before he saw the remnants of something raw in her expression, something he had not seen there before, and he understood without being told that something had happened while he was unconscious, something she had said or felt or admitted to herself, something that had changed the ground between them. Thank you, he said to her. Then to Zeke, both of you. 3 days it took for Everett to recover enough to travel, and in those 3 days, something happened that none of them planned. They became a unit. Zeke cooked meals that were simple but seasoned with a skill that spoke of another life, a mother's kitchen in Louisiana before the war, though he shared that detail only once and briefly. He read aloud in the evenings, his deep voice turning the pages of whatever book he had in hand into something that transformed the desert night into a theater, and both Everett and Jessamine found themselves leaning closer to the fire to listen. He smoked his carved pipe, and the smoke curled up into the darkness like a question mark, and his presence in the camp was like the presence of a deep-rooted tree, quiet and unmoving, and somehow making everything around it feel more stable. Everett watched him from the corner of his eye in those first days, the way he always watched new people cataloging strengths and weaknesses, reading intentions. Zeke did not carry a weapon. He did not raise his voice. He asked for nothing and offered everything: medical attention and good food and conversation, and a silence that was as comfortable as a well-fitted coat. Everett could not find the angle. could not find what Zeke wanted from them because the answer appeared to be nothing at all, and that was so unusual in his experience that it took 3 full days to begin trusting it. On the evening Everett was well enough to sit up and eat solid food, Zeke asked where they were headed and why. Everett gave the short version. Brother died in a mining accident, sold the claim. Heading to Montana for cattle ranching. Where was the mine? Zeke asked, refilling his pipe. Skidoo, Panamint Range, California. Zeke's hands stopped moving. The pipe hung suspended between his fingers unlit. Behind his spectacles, the warm, steady eyes changed, darkening the serenity draining away, to reveal something underneath that was not violent, but was absolutely unshakably certain. When he spoke again, his voice was the same measured tone, but there was iron in it that had not been there before. Hargrove Mining Company. Everett sat up straighter and the movement pulled at the wound in his arm, but he did not notice. You know Hargrove. The fire crackled. A coyote called in the distance. Zeke struck a match and lit his pipe, and in the flare of light, his face was a map of old grief, every line etched deeper by the flame's shadow. 10 years ago, he began, and his voice was even and controlled, but the pipe trembled between his long fingers. I lived in a free community in Arizona. Black families, most of us. We had land 40 acres legally purchased and properly deeded. We had a church and a schoolhouse and a well that gave good water. We had built it from nothing after the war, and it was ours. He drew on the pipe. The cherry glowed. Hargrove came through looking for mineral rights. He offered to buy the land. We refused. The land was not for sale. It was our home. A pause. 6 months later, the church burned. No one could prove arson, but everyone knew. Then the well was poisoned lime, and something else, something chemical. 2 children got sick. The men started getting beaten on the road at night, always by strangers, always wearing kerchiefs over their faces, always after someone from Hargrove's operation had been seen in the area. Another draw on the pipe. The smoke rose thin and straight in the still air. My wife Miriam was in the church the night it burned. She had gone back to get the hymnals, the ones she had copied by hand, because we could not afford printed ones. The roof came down before she could get out. Silence. The fire popped. Jessamine's hand had gone to her mouth, and her eyes glistened in the firelight. Hargrove never dirties his own hands. Zeke's voice was flat as a stone. He hires men. Virgil Slade was one of them. I saw Slade in the area the week before the fire. I reported it to the territorial marshal, who did nothing because the territorial marshal owed Hargrove money. Everett reached into the inside pocket of his duster coat and pulled out the piece of sawed timber. He held it out to Zeke without speaking. Zeke took it, turned it in those mining elegant fingers, examined the clean diagonal cut, the mud that had been packed into the saw marks to disguise them. His expression did not change. He had already known. It is his pattern, Zeke said, handing the timber back. He does not change methods because his methods work. A mine shaft collapses, a church burns, a well goes bad, always an accident, never a suspect. The 3 of them sat around the fire, and the night pressed in from all sides, and something connected between them that was stronger than friendship or convenience or the accident of meeting on a desert road. Hargrove had taken Cormac from Everett. Hargrove had taken Miriam from Zeke. Hargrove had taken Jessamine's future, the life she had sold everything for, the man she had crossed a continent to meet. 3 losses, 1 name. 3 people with nothing left to lose and everything still to build. They did not speak about revenge. That was not a word any of them used or would use. But the shape of it sat among them like a 4th person at the fire, silent, impatient. They entered southern Idaho and joined a small wagon train headed for Montana, led by a man named Captain Josiah Peters, a Union veteran in his mid-50s, with a ramrod spine and a face like weathered leather, and a habit of saying exactly what he meant with no decoration. There were 3 families in the train, all seeking farmland, and Peters had suggested they travel together because of reports of bandits in the area. Everett agreed. In a wagon train, 3 more people were 3 more guns, or in Zeke's case, 3 more sets of useful skills. And the families changed the texture of the journey in ways Everett had not anticipated. Children. The wagon train had 7 of them, ranging from a baby in arms to a 12-year-old boy who thought he was already a man, and they gravitated to Jessamine like moths to a lantern. She told them stories in the evenings, not fairy tales, but adventures tales of sea captains and mountain men and explorers who found new worlds. And she told them with a vividness that held even the 12-year-olds still. She mended their torn clothes and braided the girls' hair and settled disputes between the younger ones with a fairness that earned their instant loyalty. Everett stood at the edge of the firelight and watched. He watched the way she crouched down to meet the children at eye level, the way she listened to their questions as if each one mattered. The way she laughed, rare and genuine, the sound of it transforming her face, the scar crinkling her eyes, brightening, and the sight of it struck something in him that he could not defend against because he had not known the fortification was needed. He imagined her with children of their own. The image arrived fully formed and vivid, a girl with black hair and green eyes, a boy with his mother's fierce intelligence, and the force of it nearly took his knees out from under him. A woman named Martha Pennock, a farmer's wife built like a fence post, with hands that could wring a chicken's neck, and a mouth that said what it thought without consulting her brain, first cornered Everett one morning while he was checking the wagon wheels. "Your wife is a treasure," she said, pointing a finger at him for emphasis. "You treat her right." "I intend to." "Good. Because a woman who can still smile after weeks on a trail like this is rarer than gold in a creek bed, and you do not find that twice. Do not let her get away." Everett thought about the agreement, the handshake in the dusty street. The terms traveled together, pretend to be married part as friends in Montana. He thought about that word friends, and it sat in his chest like a stone that was the wrong shape for the space it occupied. "I am doing my best, ma'am." "Well," Martha said, "do better." They parted ways with the wagon train when the families turned east toward Bozeman. The children cried and hugged Jessamine and made her promise to write, and Everett watched her hold them and stroke their hair and promise things she might not be able to keep, and the warmth in her eyes as she waved goodbye told him everything about the kind of mother she would be and nothing about whether she would ever want that life with him. 2 days after leaving the wagon train, camped beside a creek in the Idaho mountains, with the sound of running water filling the evening air, Jessamine asked the question Everett had been dreading since Nevada. "When we reach Montana, where will you go?" Everett poked at the fire with a stick, sending a constellation of sparks into the twilight. "I have heard good things about Virginia City. Ranch land for sale still affordable. And me. Virginia City has about 3,000 people. There would be work for a seamstress. Helena is bigger if you want more opportunities." He kept his eyes on the fire. "We could both settle in the same area, if you wanted. I am not trying to decide for you." "Everett." She said his name again the way she had in the dark hotel room in Nevada, and it did the same thing to him that it had done then. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Go ahead." "You are 28, on the frontier that is not young. Why have you never married?" He set down the stick and clasped his hands between his knees. "Never met anyone who made me want to stop moving long enough to build a life." And now his heart was hammering. He could feel it in his temples, in his throat, in the palms of his hands. This was a moment that could change the direction of everything or destroy the careful structure they had built board by board over 7 weeks of shared road. "Now I have met someone." His voice was careful, measured, the words placed precisely. "But the timing is wrong. Everything about it is wrong. And I do not know if she could ever see me as anything more than her dead fiancé's brother." Jessamine drew in a sharp breath. "I should not have said that. You came west to marry Cormac, not me. I am not trying to take his place or take advantage of the situation. You are not taking anyone's place." She moved closer, kneeling beside him by the fire, and the light played across her face, the sharp cheekbones, the intensity in her expression, the scar along her jaw. "And you are right that the timing is terrible. I have not properly mourned Cormac, though that sounds callous since I never truly knew him." "It does not sound callous. It sounds honest. These weeks with you have been wonderful and confusing." The words came out in a rush, as if she had been holding them back and the dam had finally cracked. "You are nothing like I expected, Everett Colburn. You are kind in a way that you try to hide. You are funny in a way so dry that most people miss it entirely. You are smart and you treat me like an equal instead of a responsibility. But I am terrified of making another mistake, of trusting someone and being wrong about them." Everett reached out and took her hand, slowly giving her every opportunity to pull away. She did not pull away. Her fingers closed around his, and he could feel the calluses on her fingertips, and the strength in her grip, and the faint tremor that said she was as scared as he was. "I will never hurt you, Jess. I swear that on everything sacred." "I believe you." Her fingers tightened. "But I need time. Can you give me that?" "I will give you whatever you need, however long." They sat together by the fire, hands joined, and the creek sang its ancient song, and the stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky. Then Everett did something he had never done in front of another living person. He reached into his vest pocket with his free hand and drew out the brass pocket watch. He opened it and held it so Jessamine could see. Inside the cover, held in place by a small brass clip, was a photograph. Tintype faded and scratched, but still legible. Two boys standing in front of a wooden farmhouse. The older one was maybe 12, thin and serious, already wearing the expression of someone who understood that the world was not a kind place. The younger one was 8 or 9, round-faced and grinning with wild red hair. Even the black and white photograph could not tame. The older boy had his hand on the younger one's shoulder, and even in that small faded image you could read the gesture as what it was. Protection. Promise. I will keep you safe. "This is the only thing I have left of my family," Everett said, and his voice was rough with something he did not usually allow into it. "I look at it every night. I have not shown it to anyone since my parents died." Jessamine looked at the photograph for a long time. At the two boys who would become the man beside her and the man in the ground in Skidoo. At the farmhouse that no longer existed, and the childhood that had been stolen, and the brother who had died reaching upward through a pile of rock. She closed the cover gently, carefully, and placed the watch back in Everett's hand. Then she looked up at him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears, and her voice was steady as stone. "You are not alone anymore, Everett." Zeke sat on the far side of the fire, his pipe in one hand and his book in the other, and he was looking at the stars with an expression of profound stillness, as if he had heard nothing at all. But the pipe smoke curled upward in a shape that might have been a smile, and the firelight caught the wet track of a single tear on his weathered cheek that he wiped away with the back of one elegant hand and never acknowledged. 2 days later, on a narrow forested road in Idaho, Virgil Slade and 2 hired men stepped out of the trees and blocked the trail. Slade sat on a gray horse with a rifle across his saddle, and his flat, empty eyes found Everett with the dispassionate focus of a man performing a task nothing personal, just business. The 2 men with him were positioned on either side of the road, cutting off retreat, and their guns were drawn and pointed at the wagon. "Mr. Colburn," Slade's voice was colorless. "Mr. Hargrove sends his regards. He believes you have something that belongs to him. A piece of wood, perhaps. Some papers. Hand them over, and you can continue on your way." Everett was on the wagon seat. The reins were in his left hand. His right hand was at his side, inches from the holster on his hip. He did not move. The stillness that came over him was the stillness of a loaded weapon. Every muscle locked, every nerve aligned, his green eyes narrowed to slits beneath the shadow of his hat brim. One of Slade's men dismounted and moved toward the wagon. What happened next happened fast. Jessamine stood up on the wagon seat. In her right hand was the hunting knife drawn from somewhere in the folds of her riding skirt, in a motion so fluid that it looked practiced because it was. She dropped to the ground between the wagon and the approaching man and settled into a stance that was low balanced, the knife held in a reverse grip close to her body. It was not the stance of a frightened woman who had grabbed the nearest weapon. It was the stance of someone who had been taught or who had taught herself how to use a blade to stay alive. The scar along her jaw went white. Her stare went flat and cold, and her lips pressed into a line that held no fear and no mercy. The man approaching the wagon stopped. "That is close enough," Jessamine said, and her voice was quiet and even and absolutely final. Slade laughed, a short sound with no humor in it. "Interesting company you keep, Colburn." While all eyes went to Jessamine, Everett drew. The motion was economical, no wasted movement, the revolver clearing the holster and leveling and firing in a single breath. The shot hit the ground 6 inches in the front of Slade's horse, kicking up a fountain of dirt and pine needles, and the horse jumped sideways. A warning, the next one would not be. And then Zeke stepped down from the cart behind the wagon. He was unarmed as always, his hands open at his sides, his spectacles catching the dappled forest light. He walked towards Slade with the unhurried pace of a man crossing his own front porch, and his voice when he spoke carried the quiet authority of wisdom. Not the command of strength, but the gravity of a man who has read widely and suffered deeply and chosen his battles with surgical precision. Virgil Slade, I know you. Arizona Territory, 1873. The Jubilee Community. You were seen in the area the week before the church fire that killed 4 people, including my wife. His voice did not rise. His hands did not clench. I have sent a sworn statement to Judge William Morrison of the federal court in Helena, Montana. The statement names you and Mr. Hargrove and details the pattern of intimidation and violence in Arizona and now in Skidoo. If we do not arrive safely in Montana, that statement will be opened and acted upon. This is not a bluff, Mr. Slade. I am a meticulous man. I keep records. I make copies. It was half true. Zeke had written to Morrison and the letter was real, and the details it contained were accurate. The sworn statement was not yet finalized, but Slade did not know that. And Zeke's face, that weathered map of honest suffering, was not a face that invited doubt. Slade looked at the 3 of them. Everett on the wagon with a drawn gun and eyes that promised a second shot would find flesh instead of dirt. Jessamine on the ground with a knife and an expression that said she would use it and sleep soundly afterward. Zeke in the middle of the road, unarmed and unafraid, holding nothing but the truth and the willingness to deploy it. 3 people. Violence controlled, violence white intelligence calm. A configuration that offered no gap, no weakness, no point of attack that would not cost more than a gain. Slade pulled his horse back. His men retreated to the tree line. But before he turned to ride away, he spoke once more, and his voice carried the particular cruelty of a man delivering bad news he knows will land. Hargrove already bought the land in Montana you were looking at, Colburn, the parcel outside Virginia City. Signed the deed 2 weeks ago. You have got nothing waiting for you up there. Then they were gone, swallowed by the trees, and the forest was quiet again, except for the sound of the creek and the nervous blowing of the horses. That night, around a fire that seemed smaller than usual, the 3 of them sat in a silence that was not comfortable. The adrenaline had drained away, leaving exhaustion and something colder. Everett's jaw ached from clenching. Jessamine had sheathed her knife, but her hand kept drifting to her belt, checking. Everett looked at her across the fire. You know how to fight with a knife. It was not a question. Jessamine was still for a long moment. Then, staring into the flames, she began to speak. His name was Malcolm Trent. He owned the boarding house in Boston where I rented a room. He was charming at first, polite, respectful. He brought me tea in the evenings and asked about my sewing and listened when I talked about books. She paused. Then the tea became wine. The questions became demands. The listening became following. He followed me to the market and back. He waited outside the shop where I worked. He told me that I owed him kindness because he had been kind to me. The fire cracked. Zeke smoked his pipe and looked at the stars and gave her the space to speak at her own pace. When I refused him, he hit me. The first time it was an open hand. The second time it was a fist. The third time he wore a ring. She touched the scar on her jaw, tracing the thin line from below her ear nearly to her chin. I stabbed him with my sewing scissors. In the shoulder. He screamed and let go, and I ran. He did not die, but he would have come back, and the next time he would not have stopped at my face. She looked up, and her gaze in the firelight was dry and fierce and utterly unashamed. Cormac's advertisement for a mail-order bride was pinned to the board at the post office. I answered it the same day I stabbed Malcolm Trent. I did not come to California for romance, Everett. I came because if I stayed in Boston, I would be dead, or I would have had to kill someone. The fire cracked again, a long silence. Everett's voice when it came was rough as gravel. You are safe now, I will make sure of that. Jessamine looked at him, and what passed between them across the fire was not the look of a woman seeking protection or a man offering it. It was the look of 2 people who had each survived something that should have broken them, recognizing in each other the scars and the stubbornness and the refusal to let the world win. I know, she said. That is why I stayed. Zeke drew on his pipe one last time, knocked the ashes out against a rock, and said quietly, It is late. We should rest. Montana is close now, and we will need our strength for what comes next. He did not specify what that was. He did not need to. They all knew. The fire burned down. The stars wheeled. Three people with three griefs and one shared enemy lay in the darkness of an Idaho forest, and the road to Montana stretched northward ahead of them, and whatever was waiting there, they would face it together. They reached Virginia City on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of August, 7 weeks after leaving Skidoo, and the first thing Everett noticed was the grass. After weeks of desert and rock and scrub that clung to existence like a prayer, the grass of Montana's Madison Valley hit him with the force of a physical blow. It was everywhere, knee-high and green and rippling in a wind that carried the smell of clean water and pine instead of dust and baked stone. Mountains rose on every side, blue and enormous, their peaks still holding snow even in August. And the sky above was so vast and so deep that looking up felt like looking into an ocean turned upside down. Virginia City was a real town in a way that Skidoo had never been and never would be. Proper buildings of brick and timber lined the main street, 2 stories, some of them with glass windows and painted signs. There were churches with steeples and a schoolhouse with a bell and a courthouse with actual steps leading up to actual doors. Horses and wagons filled the street, and the boardwalks were busy with men and women who walked like people with somewhere to go and a reason for going there. The air tasted like possibility, and Everett drank it in and felt something in his chest that he had not felt in years, perhaps ever. Hope raw and terrifying. Jessamine sat beside him on the wagon seat and breathed in with her eyes closed, her face tipped up to the Montana sun, and when she opened her eyes, they were bright with something that was neither tears nor laughter, but lived somewhere between. "It is beautiful," she said. "It is." Zeke rode behind them on his old mule, the cart rattling over the ruts, his spectacles catching the afternoon light. He looked around Virginia City with the measured assessment of a man who had been to many places and learned to recognize the ones where he might be willing to stop. "This could work," he said to no one in particular, and his voice carried the quiet satisfaction of a man setting down a heavy load. They found rooms at a boarding house on the edge of town, modest but clean run by a widow named Mrs. Cartwright, who asked no questions and charged a fair price. Everett stabled the horses at the livery, unloaded the wagon, and then walked directly to the land office. The clerk was a young man with ink-stained fingers and a nervous disposition who flipped through a ledger book with the speed of someone who had delivered bad news before and had learned to do it quickly. "The parcel you are describing, 320 acres in the South Valley Creek running through it, Cottonwood Grove on the north end." The clerk's fingers stopped on a line in the ledger. "Sold, 2 weeks ago, purchased by the Hargrove Mining Company." Everett stood at the counter and felt the floor drop out from under him, not literally but in every way that mattered. The hope that had been building in his chest since they crested the ridge and saw the valley, that fragile, terrifying hope, shattered like a pane of glass hit by a stone, and the pieces fell somewhere inside him and settled into a pile of sharp edges that cut with every breath. He did not move. His face did not change. The clerk, watching nervously, saw nothing more dramatic than a tall man in a dusty duster coat standing very still at a counter, his green eyes going flat and dark beneath the brim of his hat, the muscles along his jaw flexing once and then locking into place. But the clerk took an involuntary step backward anyway, because there are kinds of stillness that are more frightening than violence, and this was one of them. "Thank you," Everett said, and his voice was perfectly even, perfectly controlled, and perfectly empty. He walked outside into the sunlight and stood on the boardwalk and looked at the mountains without seeing them. Hargrove, even here. 2,000 miles from Skidoo, and the man's reach had arrived before him, had planted a flag in the exact piece of land that Everett had been dreaming about for 7 weeks of hard road, the land where he would build the cabin and raise the cattle and make the home he had been afraid to want for his entire adult life. Gone. Bought with money that might as well have been Cormac's blood. Jessamine found him there. She did not ask if he was all right because she could see that he was not, and she had enough respect for him not to pretend otherwise. She simply stood beside him, close enough that her shoulder nearly touched his arm, and she placed her hand on his forearm lightly over the healing snakebite, and she was there. Not fixing anything, not offering solutions or comfort or false optimism. Just present the way a stone wall is present when you need something to lean against. Zeke arrived a few minutes later, having heard the news from the clerk. He stood on Everett's other side, his hands clasped behind his back, his spectacles reflecting the mountains, and he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Hargrove is expanding into Montana. That means he is creating a longer paper trail, more transactions, more records, more people involved. He adjusted his spectacles with one long finger. A longer trail is a more fragile trail, and somewhere in it, there will be a crack. That night in the small room at the boarding house, Everett sat on the narrow bed and finally opened Cormac's letter. He had carried it for 7 weeks across 1,200 miles of desert and mountain, the envelope softened by sweat and body heat and the constant pressure of the coat pocket against his ribs. The wax seal had partly melted and rehardened. His brother's handwriting on the front, large and sloppy and achingly familiar, seemed to pulse in the lamplight. He broke the seal and unfolded the pages. There were 3 of them written on both sides in Cormac's enormous hand, words misspelled with the confident carelessness of a man who had always trusted his mouth more than his pen. And folded inside the pages was a 4th document, different paper, different handwriting, official and notarized. The letter read the way Cormac talked fast and loud and jumping between ideas. He knew someone was sabotaging the claim. Timber supports cut tools going missing, a threatening note left at the cabin door. He suspected Hargrove, though he could not prove it. But more important than the sabotage was what he had found. The silver vein was real. Not just real, but substantial, running deep into the mountain, worth more than anything Hargrove had offered or would offer. Cormac had taken samples to an assayer in the next town away from Skidoo, where Hargrove controlled everything, and the assayer's report confirmed it. And then in the clumsy handwriting of a man who was not educated but was not stupid, Cormac had done something brilliant. He had gone to a notary in that same town and signed a deed of transfer legally conveying ownership of the claim to his brother Everett Colburn, dated and witnessed and stamped 2 weeks before the cave-in that killed him. The notarized deed was the document folded inside the letter. The last page was shorter. The handwriting was less steady, as if Cormac had been writing in a hurry or in the dark. Dear brother, if you are reading this, then I was right, and somebody got to me before I could get out. Do not be sad for too long, because that is a waste, and you know I hate waste. Do something with the claim, or do something without it, but build something good. I always knew you could. You just never believed it yourself. And one more thing. There is a woman named Jessamine coming on the stage. Look after her for me. She is special. I could tell from her letters. She deserves better than what she got. So do you. Everett sat on the bed holding the letter and the deed, and the lamp guttered and the shadow swung across the walls. His hands were shaking. Not his whole body, just his hands, those large scarred hands with the shortened ring finger trembling, the way they had not trembled when the snake struck, or when Slade pointed a gun at him, or when he drew his own weapon in the Idaho forest. The trembling came from somewhere deeper than fear, from a place he had sealed shut 11 years ago when he stood in a Texas churchyard and decided that the only safe way to live was to never need anyone again. Cormac had known he was in danger, had planned for it, had taken steps to protect his brother and the woman he had never met. Had done all of this with the cheerful pragmatism of a man who believed the best about people even when the evidence suggested otherwise. Had been smart, genuinely smart, in a way that Everett had never fully credited, because Cormac's intelligence did not look like intelligence. It looked like optimism. It looked like trust. It looked like a big red-haired man with a broken nose and a burn-scarred hand who grinned too much and talked too loud and believed that the next swing of the pickaxe would change everything. And he had been right. The door opened. Jessamine stood in the doorway, the hall lamp behind her outlining her dark braid and the straight line of her shoulders. She saw his face. She did not speak. She walked to the bed and sat down beside him and placed her hand on his shoulder, and Everett leaned into her. Not an embrace, not a collapse, just a leaning, a transfer of weight from a man who had carried everything alone for too long to a woman who was strong enough to bear it. It was the first time since he was 17 years old that Everett Colburn had leaned on another human being. The next morning, Zeke and Jessamine sat with Everett at the small table in Mrs. Cartwright's dining room, and they laid out everything they had: the sawed timber, the deed Cormac had signed, the letter, Zeke's knowledge of Hargrove's pattern in Arizona, the encounter with Slade on the Idaho road. Zeke laid it out with the methodical precision of a surgeon planning an operation. Cormac signed the deed 2 weeks before he died, legally transferring the claim to Everett. When Everett sold the claim to Hargrove in Skidoo, he was selling property that was legally his by right of Cormac's transfer. but the sale was conducted under duress immediately following the murder of the previous owner by the man who arranged that murder. No court in the territory would uphold that transaction if presented with this evidence. The land in Montana, Everett said. Hargrove bought it with money from the Ski-Doo operation. If the Ski-Doo sale is voided, the Montana purchase unravels. Zeke nodded. Judge William Morrison in Helena. Federal appointment, not territorial. He cannot be bought by Hargrove the way the marshal in Arizona was bought. I wrote to him from Nevada and the letter should have arrived by now. What we need is to file a formal complaint with supporting evidence and find local witnesses who can testify to Hargrove's methods here in Montana. Jessamine spoke. He is operating the same way here, is he not? Buying land, intimidating holders, consolidating. Almost certainly, men like Hargrove do not change because they do not need to. Everett stood. I will find the witnesses. He spent 3 days walking through Virginia City talking to men in saloons and stables and along fence lines the way a cattleman talks, not with questions, but with silences that other men felt compelled to fill. He found what he expected. Hargrove Mining Company had been in the area for 6 months, buying claims and land parcels, and not everyone had sold willingly. There were stories of threats of fences, cut of livestock gone missing, of a barn burned on the Henriksen homestead north of town, and he found Dutch Meyer. Dutch was a blacksmith, 40 years old, born in Bavaria, built like a cathedral. He had a forge on the south end of Virginia City, and when Everett walked in, the heat from the fire and the ringing of the hammer on the anvil hit him simultaneously like twin fists. Dutch was shaping a horseshoe, his massive arms bare to the shoulder, his leather apron scarred with burns, and he did not look up until the shoe was finished and quenched in the water barrel with a hiss of steam. Then he looked at Everett with eyes that were wary and tired. What do you want? I want to talk about Hargrove. Dutch's hands tightened on the tongs. I do not talk about Hargrove. He wants your forge. A muscle jumped in Dutch's jaw. He wants everything. That is what men like him do. They want, and they take, and they do not stop. He killed my brother in Ski-Doo, sabotaged a mine shaft. I have proof. Dutch was still for a long time, the tongs motionless in his massive hands, the forge fire painting his face in shades of red and orange. Then he set the tongs down on the anvil with a clang that rang through the shop like a church bell. What kind of proof? 2 weeks after arriving in Virginia City on a Sunday morning with the church bells ringing and the mountains shining in the clean light, Everett married Jessamine Vaughn. It was a small ceremony. The minister was a soft-spoken man named Reverend Talbot, who asked no questions about how the bride and groom had come to find each other. The church was simple whitewashed pine with sunlight streaming through plain glass windows and dust motes floating in the beams like gold dust in a creek. Jessamine wore her deep forest green day dress with black velvet trim at the collar and cuffed small jet black buttons down the front of the bodice. Her hair was braided and coiled neatly at the nape of her neck, pinned with simple tortoiseshell combs. Black lace-up ankle boots. A thin black ribbon choker at her throat. Everett had bought flowers from a woman's garden that morning. Wild roses and columbine, and Jessamine held them in hands that were steady and sure. Everett had cleaned and pressed his best shirt. His hair was combed, the silver at the temples catching the window light. He had left the duster coat in the gun belt at the boarding house, and without them, he looked younger, less armored, almost vulnerable. His green eyes were bright with something that might have been fear and might have been joy, and was probably both. Zeke stood behind them as witness. He wore his vest buttoned neatly over a clean white shirt, his spectacles polished, his pipe left behind out of respect for the church. His hands were clasped in front of him, and the expression behind the wire-frame glasses held quiet, complex emotion, the look of a man watching something beautiful happen in a world that he knew from hard experience was not always beautiful. His right hand in his trouser pocket rested against the small photograph of Miriam that he kept in a leather case next to his heart. I, Everett Colburn, take you, Jessamine Vaughn, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you, honor you, and stand beside you through everything that lies ahead until death parts us. I, Jessamine Vaughn, take you, Everett Colburn, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love you, honor you, and fight beside you through every storm this life brings until death parts us. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and when Everett kissed his bride, it was gentle and brief and somehow contained everything that neither of them had been able to say in 7 weeks of conversation and silence and slowly dissolving distance. Jessamine's hand came up to rest against his jaw, her fingertips touching the edge of the scar above his eyebrow, and she smiled a real smile, unguarded and radiant, and it was the most beautiful thing Everett Colburn had ever seen. That evening, the door of their room at the boarding house closed softly behind them. When morning came, everything between them had changed, not only through the vows they had spoken before the minister, but through a quieter, more private choosing, tender and complete. Whatever had been tentative between them was now settled, and they faced the new day as partners in every sense of the word. The crack in Hargrove's empire came as Zeke had predicted through paper. Everett filed a formal complaint with Judge Morrison's office in Helena, attaching Cormac's deed of transfer of the sawed timber. As physical evidence, Zeke's detailed account of the Arizona pattern and statements from Dutch Meyer and two other Virginia City residents who had been threatened by Hargrove's agents. Morrison, a federal appointee with a reputation for incorruptibility that had survived 3 attempts to buy him and 1 to shoot him, accepted the case and scheduled a hearing in Virginia City. Hargrove's response came before the law did. 3 weeks after the wedding, in the small hours of a cold September night, Everett woke to the sound of shouting and the smell of smoke. He was out of bed and dressed and through the door before Jessamine had fully opened her eyes. And when he reached the south end of town, he saw Dutch Meyer's forge engulfed in flames, the fire leaping 30 feet into the black sky, sparks wheeling upward like furious stars. Dutch was there already, hauling equipment out through the heat, his massive arms blackened with soot, his beard singed his eyes, reflecting the fire with a fury that made them look like coals themselves. Everett grabbed a bucket and joined the line that was forming Virginia City residents passing water, hand to hand from the nearest well, and they fought the fire for 2 hours, but the forge was lost. In the smoking wreckage visible on a section of wall that had not completely burned, someone had carved a letter into the wood. A single letter, large and deliberate. H. Dutch stood in front of the ruin of his livelihood, his enormous hands clenched into fists at his sides, his chest heaving, and when he turned to look at Everett, his eyes held something that had not been there before. In the days of careful conversation, Dutch had been willing to testify, but cautiously, reluctantly, a man protecting what little he had. Now he had nothing left to protect, and that made him something far more dangerous than cautious. Before I was willing to talk in court, Dutch said, his voice low and rough with smoke and rage. Now I want that man to lose everything. The next morning, Everett walked into Hargrove's temporary office on Virginia City's Main Street. He walked in alone, without his gun, because Jessamine had looked at him before he left and said, "If you bring the gun, you give him a reason to call you the criminal instead of him." She was right, and he knew it, and so he went unarmed into the presence of the man who had killed his brother. Hargrove's office was rented temporary, a sign that he had not yet established himself in Virginia City the way he had in Skidoo. He sat behind a desk that was too large for the room, and Virgil Slade stood in his usual position against the wall, his hand resting on his holster, with the casual ease of a man who used the weapon the way most men used a pen. "Mr. Colburn." Hargrove's smile was automatic, the reflex of a man who had smiled his way through decades of transactions, legal and otherwise. "I heard about the fire at the blacksmith's forge. Terrible business. These wooden buildings in these mountain towns, a single spark and whoosh." Everett did not sit down. He stood in the middle of the room, 6'3", the duster coat open, no gun belt, and looked at Hargrove the way he would look at a rattlesnake that he had already decided to kill but was choosing the right moment. "You burned Dutch Meyer's forge. I do not know what you are suggesting. You killed my brother, sabotaged the mine shaft in Skidoo, had the timber supports sawed through so the ceiling would come down on him." Hargrove's smile flickered. Slade pushed off from the wall, his hand closing on his revolver. "You killed Miriam Holloway in Arizona, burned a church with people inside, poisoned a well, drove a community off their land. These are serious accusations, Mr. Colburn. Do you have a lawyer? I have something better." Everett's voice was level, cold, steady as a carpenter's beam. "I have the truth. I have documents. I have a deed that my brother signed before you killed him. I have a piece of timber with saw marks that no accident would produce. I have a federal judge who is not for sale, and I have witnesses, Mr. Hargrove. More of them than you know, because it turns out that when you hurt enough people, some of them eventually decide to talk." He took one step closer, Slade drew his revolver halfway. Everett did not look at him. The cold, calculated patience was fully present, now the unblinking focus of a man who knew exactly what violence cost and had decided long ago that he would only spend it when the price was worth paying. "You will lose everything," Everett said. "Not because I am stronger or faster or richer than you, because my brother was smarter than you thought. He knew what you were doing, and he planned for it. He protected his claim, and he protected me, and he protected a woman he had never met, and he did it all from beyond the grave. You cannot beat a dead man, Mr. Hargrove. You already tried, and you failed." He turned his back on Hargrove and Slade and walked to the door. His spine was straight, his shoulders level, his boot heels striking the wooden floor with measured deliberation. He did not look back. The door opened, the sunlight poured in, and he walked through it and out onto the street and kept walking. Behind him in the office, Hargrove sat very still. Slade's revolver was drawn but pointing at the floor because somewhere in the middle of Everett's speech, he had understood that shooting this man would not solve the problem, would in fact make it catastrophically worse. And even a man with empty eyes knows when he is beaten. Judge Morrison arrived in Virginia City the following week, traveling with a federal marshal and a court reporter. The hearing was held in the Virginia City courthouse, and the courtroom was full because word had spread through the valley the way fire spreads through dry grass, and men and women who had been afraid of Hargrove for months came to watch someone finally stand up to him. Zeke presented the evidence. He stood before the judge in his vest, in white shirt, and polished shoes, his spectacles clean, his voice measured and precise, and he laid out the case the way he would have performed a surgery, step by careful step, cutting away the infected tissue to reveal the damage beneath. The Arizona pattern, the Skidoo sabotage, the timber evidence, Cormac's deed, the threats against Dutch Meyer, the fire. Everett testified, brief and direct the way he did everything, each sentence a nail driven straight and true. Jessamine took the stand and presented Cormac's deed and read aloud the final passage of his letter, the part about Jessamine being special and Everett deserving better, and her voice was steady as stone, but her eyes were bright, and the courtroom went quiet in the particular silence that falls when people hear something true spoken by someone brave enough to say it. Dutchmeyer testified, his massive frame barely fitting in the witness chair, his voice thick with accent and anger, and he described the threats and the fire with the plain-spoken directness of a man who had nothing left to lose and had discovered that having nothing to lose was a kind of freedom. Morrison's ruling was thorough and unambiguous. The sale of Cormac's claim in Skidoo was voided on grounds of duress, fraud, and complicity in the death of the rightful owner. Hargrove's purchase of the Montana land, financed by proceeds from the fraudulent acquisition, was suspended pending full investigation. Hargrove was held for trial. Virgil Slade was arrested on the federal marshal's warrant. The 320 acres in the South Valley, the land with the creek and the cottonwood grove and the mountains rising blue in the distance, came back onto the open market. Everett signed the papers on a Wednesday afternoon. He walked out of the land office holding the deed, and the paper shook slightly in his hands, and he stood on the boardwalk and looked at the document and then looked at Jessamine, who was waiting on the street below, and his voice when he found it was not quite steady. "I own land, 320 acres. My name on the deed." Jessamine came up the steps and put her arms around his neck and held him, and he held her back, and the deed was pressed between them, and for a moment the whole busy street of Virginia City might as well have been empty. "You are a landowner now, Mr. Colburn, a rancher." "Not yet. I need to build a cabin, buy cattle, figure out how to make this work. We will figure it out together." They built the cabin in September, working from dawn to dusk, while the Montana autumn turned the cottonwoods gold, and the first hints of frost appeared on the grass in the mornings. Everett felled timber and hauled it on his back across the meadow, the smell of fresh-cut pine filling the valley. Jessamine held boards steady while he hammered mixed mortar for the chimney sketch floor plans in her journal. 2 rooms and a loft, a stone fireplace that Everett built carefully, remembering the one in Skidoo that smoked and determined that this one would not. A solid plank floor with no gaps, a door that hung true, walls that would hold against the Montana wind. Everett built a bed frame from pine and sanded it smooth until it felt like silk under his calloused hands. Jessamine sewed curtains from fabric she bought in town, And when she hung them in the windows, the cabin stopped being a structure and became a home. They moved in on a cool September evening. The fireplace drew perfectly, the flames casting warm light across the room, and Jessamine stood in the middle of their home and turned slowly, taking in every board and nail and seam. "It is not much," Everett said, standing in the doorway. Jessamine looked at him, and her smile was the one he had first seen on their wedding day, unguarded and luminous. "It is everything. It is ours, Everett. We built it with our own hands. That makes it perfect." Zeke came to visit 2 days later, riding his old mule up the valley road, and he sat on the porch Everett had built and smoked his pipe and looked out at the land. "Cormac would have liked this place," he said. Yes, Everett sat beside him. He would have. Zeke had settled in Virginia City, renting a small room and opening a modest practice. His reputation spread quickly because competent physicians were rare and kind ones were rarer, and within a month he had more patients than he could comfortably handle. He came to the ranch every Sunday for dinner, and it became a ritual, the three of them around the table that Everett had built, eating whatever Jessamine had cooked, talking until the fire burned low and the stars came out. The first winter was hard, the way first winters in Montana always are. Everett bought 20 cattle and 2 horses with nearly every dollar they had left. He built a rough barn and spent long days cutting hay and chopping firewood, coming home at dusk with his hands raw and his shoulders aching and the cold settling into his bones. Jessamine kept the cabin warm and tended a root cellar and sewed clothes from trade goods and planned a garden for spring. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, Everett reading aloud from books Zeke loaned them, while Jessamine worked her needle, and the quiet between them was the good kind, the kind that does not need to be filled. The snow came in November, and by December they were often snowed in the world, reduced to the cabin and the barn and the white distance between them. But the fireplace held, and the food held, and they held each other in the narrow bed under the quilt Jessamine was making, and the winter passed the way winters pass when you are warm and fed and not alone. On Christmas morning, Jessamine gave Everett the finished quilt. She had been working on it for months, hidden under a blanket, whenever he came near, pieced from scraps of fabric, each one chosen for color and texture, and some private meaning he would never fully understand. The pattern was a star, and in the center she had embroidered their initials and their wedding date in tiny, precise stitches. "For our bed," she said, holding it out with a shyness that was unlike her, and therefore precious. "So we always remember this first year." Everett pulled her close and buried his face in her hair, which smelled of wood smoke and lavender and home. "It is beautiful. You are beautiful." "There is something else." Jessamine's cheeks flushed, and her expression was enormous, with something she could barely contain. "I am carrying a child. The baby will come in early summer." The world stopped, not the planet which continued its indifferent rotation, but Everett Colburn's world, the private interior landscape that he had kept barren and empty for so long because barren and empty was safe. Something broke open in him, and what came through was not pain but light, blinding and terrifying and warm. "A child. We are going to have a child." "Are you happy?" He laughed. Everett Colburn laughed, a sound so unfamiliar that Jessamine stared at him in amazement, because in 7 months she had seen him smile exactly twice and laugh exactly never. It was a good laugh, low and full, and it shook loose something in the cabin that had been too tight, some last resistance against joy. "Happy does not come close, Jess. I am terrified and grateful and so full of something I do not have a word for that I can barely stand up." He held her carefully, the way you hold something irreplaceable, and outside the window, the Montana snow fell soft and steady, and the mountains watched, and the land that bore their name waited patiently for the spring and everything that would come with it. The baby arrived on a warm June evening after a labor that lasted from dawn to dusk. Zeke rode out from Virginia City with his medical bag when word reached him, and he and the midwife attended to Jessamine, while Everett wore a path in the porch boards, pacing back and forth with Scout and Nickel watching him from the corral with expressions of mild equine concern. The first cry came as the sun touched the top of the mountains, thin and fierce, and absolutely certain of its right to be heard. Zeke opened the cabin door and looked at Everett over his spectacles, and the old doctor's face was creased with a smile that reached places smiles did not usually reach. "You have a son, Mr. Colburn." Everett went in. Jessamine lay in their bed, exhausted, her dark hair loose and damp against the pillow, and in her arms was a small bundle wrapped in a piece of the quilt she had made. She pulled back the fabric, and Everett looked at his son's face for the first time, red and wrinkled and furious about the indignity of having been born, and felt every wall he had ever built inside himself come down at once like a mine shaft that had been holding up too long. "He is perfect," he said, and his voice cracked on the second word. They named him Cormac. It was not a decision they discussed because it did not need discussing. It was the only name that could have been right. Years passed the way years pass on a working ranch, measured not by calendars, but by seasons and harvests, and the slow accumulation of small triumphs. Cormac grew from a red-faced newborn into a boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's sharp green eyes, and a disposition that reminded everyone who had known his uncle of the man he was named for. Loud, cheerful, confident, fearless. He said his first words sitting in Everett's lap, took his first steps on the cabin's plank floor, and rode his first horse at 3, sitting in front of his father on Scout's aging back. When Cormac was 4, Jessamine told Everett she was expecting again, and in the spring they welcomed a daughter. She had jet black hair and Everett's serious expression, and Jessamine's fierce intelligence, and they named her Grace. She climbed trees and rode horses and feared nothing, and Everett watched her with the bewildered pride of a man who had produced something wilder than himself. The cabin grew. Everett added 2 rooms and a proper kitchen, and Jessamine planted roses by the front door, deep red, and they bloomed every summer and filled the air with a sweetness that seemed impossible in a country this big and this hard. The ranch expanded. More land, more cattle, more horses. Everett's reputation for fair dealing and quality stock spread through the valley, and men came to buy from him because his word was as good as a contract and his handshake was better. Jessamine opened a small dress shop in Virginia City, and women traveled hours for her work because her stitching was flawless, and her eye for what suited a person was uncanny. Zeke came every Sunday. The children called him Uncle Zeke, and he taught them to read and told them stories and played the piano he had found at an estate sale in Helena, his long, elegant fingers coaxing music from the keys with a tenderness that made Jessamine cry the first time she heard it. Sometimes when he thought no one was watching, he would open the leather case that held Miriam's photograph and sit with it in his lap on the porch, the sunset reflected in his spectacles, his face carrying that particular expression of dignified grief that never fully healed but had learned to coexist with joy. When Cormac was 8, Jessamine had twins. Matthew and Michael, identical in appearance, opposite in temperament, united in their ability to create chaos. And when she was 40, a surprise that made both of them laugh and shake their heads, a last daughter born in spring when the roses bloomed. They named her Hope, and she was doted on by her siblings, and she grew up on a prosperous ranch surrounded by family, never knowing the hardship and uncertainty that had forged her parents. Young Cormac was 15 when he proposed expanding into horse breeding. He presented his plan to Everett with the careful detail and earnest seriousness of a boy who had his mother's head for business and his father's instinct for livestock. Everett listened and looked at Jessamine, who was smiling. "Your son takes after his mother," Everett said. "He takes after both of us," Jessamine corrected, "and it is an excellent idea." 3 years later, Colburn Ranch horses were known throughout Montana. Grace became a teacher, training in Helena, and returning to open a school on the ranch. The twins found their own paths, Matthew to cattle and Michael to the law. Hope grew up reading Uncle Zeke's books and asking questions that none of the adults could answer. And the years turned and the seasons came and went, and the ranch that Everett and Jessamine had built from nothing became something that would outlast them both. Everett was 52 years old when he stood in the doorway of the ranch house on an evening in late summer, watching the sun go down over the land. The valley stretched out before him, green and gold, in the fading light, dotted with cattle bearing the Colburn brand. The cabin had long since become a proper ranch house with a barn and outbuildings and a bunkhouse for the hands, and a garden where Jessamine's roses bloomed in colors that had no right to exist this far north. Smoke rose from the kitchen chimney, and through the windows he could see the warm light of lamps and the movement of his family preparing dinner. Young Cormac had married the year before. His wife was expecting. A grandchild on the way. Jessamine came to stand beside him in the doorway. Her hair was threaded with silver, now the black and the white mingling like the keys of the piano that Zeke played on Sunday afternoons. Her face was lined, but the lines were the right kind: laugh lines at the eyes and strength lines at the mouth, the cartography of a life fully lived. The scar along her jawline had faded to nearly nothing, a ghost of the wound that had once defined her. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "The telegram." His voice was quiet. "The one that arrived the day after I buried Cormac, saying you were coming on the afternoon stage. A lifetime ago." Jessamine took his hand. Her fingers fit between his, the way they always had, the calluses matching the scars, the spaces aligning, as if they had been designed for exactly this purpose. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been if Cormac had lived, if you had married him instead of me?" She shook her head. "No, I think things happened the way they were meant to happen. Cormac brought me to you. His dream became our dream, and we made it real. I miss him, even now. Maybe he knows." Jessamine leaned her head against Everett's shoulder. "Maybe somewhere Cormac is glad that the two people he loved most found each other." From inside the house came the sounds of dinner being prepared. Plates on a table, children arguing and laughing. And underneath it, the sound of a piano, a slow melody played by long, elegant fingers, because Zeke was 69 years old now, with a stoop in his back and silver in what remained of his hair, but his hands were still steady, and his music still filled the room the way lamplight fills a window. "I would do it all again," Everett said. "Every hard mile, every cold night, every moment I was afraid. It all led here, to you, to this." "So would I." Jessamine squeezed his hand. "I left Boston looking for a new beginning, and I found so much more. I found home. I found you." Everett turned and kissed her temple, her silver and black hair warm against his lips. "Forever, Tom. Forever, until the end of our days and beyond." They turned to go inside toward the light and the noise and the smell of supper and the sound of music. But Everett paused in the doorway and looked back once more at the land. The mountains were going purple in the twilight. The first stars were appearing one by one in a sky so wide it held everything that mattered and more. In his vest pocket, the old brass watch lay against his heart. Inside it, the faded photograph of two boys in front of a Texas farmhouse was still there, but beside it, now tucked in carefully, was a small pencil drawing that Hope had made when she was 6. 5 children and a man with round spectacles, all holding hands in a line. The new family beside the old one. Everyone together the way it was supposed to be. The telegram that arrived in Skidoo all those years ago had not just brought Jessamine into his life. It had brought everything. Every hope he had been afraid to name, and every Charlie he had not believed he deserved. Their story born from tragedy and uncertainty, and the simple, impossible courage of a woman who refused to turn back, had become something beautiful and enduring, a testament to second chances, and to the unexpected ways that love finds you when you are brave enough to let it through the door. Jessamine had chosen to stay, and together they had found not just love, but a lifetime of happiness in the wild, vast, beautiful heart of Montana.